Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of Anatolian Dispatch, one of several podcasts sponsored by Aval News, your best source of information on all things Turkish. Anatolian Dispatch focuses on Turkey's foreign relations from the perspective of English speakers who have an abiding interest in Turkey and all things Turkish. With us today is Dr. Chris Kilford, who was with us a couple of weeks ago. For those of you, just to recap, I won't give his entire resume, but I will tell you that he holds a PhD in history from Queen's University with a special focus on civilian military relations in the developing world. And he is currently a fellow with Queen's Center for International Defense Policy. He had a 36-year career in the Canadian Armed Forces. He commanded the 4th Air Defense Regiment, and he had other senior positions in the Canadian Department of National Defense. Chris and I met when he was Colonel Chris Kilford at the Canadian Embassy in Ankara as the Defense Attaché, where he was also accredited to Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Turkmenistan. And he retired from the Canadian Armed Forces in September 2014. Since then, he has been very busy in Turkish affairs. He has written book chapters, articles, opinion pieces on Canadian defense and foreign policy issues, plus on Turkish and Middle East matters. And he has appeared in numerous Canadian international publications. And if you can find it, I would tell you that his comments immediately following the attempted coup in July 2016 are worth viewing again, because I think some of the prognosis that you gave have turned out to be absolutely true. So you can just find that stuff on YouTube, I believe, through was Canadian Broadcasting Company.
Yeah, a lot of places actually. I did a report for the Canadian Defense Academy Institute in 2018, sort of summarizing things, and then other commentary as well about the coup. And lo and behold, I was on Daily Sabah this morning. And I saw that a few more, well, at least 150 or more alleged followers of Fethullah Gulen had or were being arrested. And that follows another story from, I think, a couple of days ago, where another 200 retired and serving military personnel, some police as well, were being arrested. So you can imagine, we've spoken about this before, but here we are, more than 4 years after the coup, and in fact, approaching almost 5 years, and people are still being arrested, and not just retired people, but people that are still in the system, so to speak, still serving, and probably wondering from day to day, if they are followers of Fethullah Gulen, or even if they're not, and just alleged to be, wondering if when they're going to work that day, what might happen.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's of course it still resonates. And the other thing is that, we can talk about this maybe in another session, because there's things we wanted to get to today. You sometimes wonder, do people, for political reasons, never want to put it behind them? In other words, it's not to become a historical event, it's to remain an ongoing, an open sore in the body politic, because there's advantages to be gained from certain parties for that. But that's really a thing we can discuss at another time. It could be because, as you mentioned, there's all these people still being arrested, and
and it's your armed forces. And if we were talking about another NATO military, perhaps, that wasn't so busy on so many different fronts around the Middle East, then this would perhaps be a different conversation. But we're talking about tearing apart internally a military that is engaged on many fronts, and is operationally active inside the country and outside the country. And this then it really does tear at the fabric of the armed forces. Now, they'll put a very brave face on things, because that is the way armed forces are. But there has to be a point where this no longer becomes useful in terms of the country moving forward. Now, I guess on the other hand, the Turkish government would argue that you can't allow members of the Gulen movement to continue serving, and if they're there, they have to be sought out.
Right. I mean, it's, I think there are many people who would be very content if they were convinced that the people being rooted out really had something to do with the coup. And this gets into the political thing of, you and I know people who clearly had no involvement with the coup, but were incarcerated for months at a time. And then, of course, the charges were dropped and they were released. But, so it remains that resonating issue for much of what happens in Turkey. And,
yeah, it's a careful balance for the government. Any historian of Turkey's military and political world will know that there have always been groups in the armed forces that have worked to topple the political level. Some have succeeded and some haven't succeeded, and they've been rooted out. I mean, this has happened decade after decade after decade. Here we are. It's 2021. Nothing has changed. That's the really sad point, because we are talking about a NATO armed forces. And what happens with this kind of model that we're seeing is, yeah, okay, folks are getting rooted out, but what that does do for the rest of the military, it puts them on the defensive. They close ranks. They start talking with one another. And in a few years' time, you have another problem with the armed forces. And I can tell you, being a historian and looking at the Turkish military, you can fill up busloads of experts who have said after every coup that it was the last one in Turkey. And that if you look after the 1960 coup, for example, the experts said that, well, look, great fellows, they did what they had to do, but now they've turned over the power to a civilian government. And of course, then we saw another coup in 71, and we all know the numbers. Anybody listening will know the numbers. But what people don't often realize is that from 1961, starting with Cemal Gürsel, all the way up to Kenan Evren, the presidents of Turkey, albeit a ceremonial role, yes, but with still a lot of power, were generals.
Yeah,
they were there.
Right.
From 1961 to 1989, until Turgut Özal came in as the president, you had that military presence, always keeping an eye out as to what was happening in the with government, with civilian government. And so, this is the dilemma for the government, that they create conditions that will lead to another issue with the armed forces down the road. That's why it's a real a balancing act for them. When are they going to have to stop purging the military?
Yeah. So let's segue from the difficulties of the government's relation with the military and bring up a topic which has to do with the government's relation with its NATO partners. I mean, you mentioned a couple times just now. It is a NATO nation, and I think we can say it's a significant NATO member. We've talked before about how there's probably a little more enthusiasm about how capable they are as a military force, but they do have some ability.
Yeah, definitely. We do have to get away from people just writing because they hear it time and time again that it's the second largest armed forces in NATO, perhaps on paper, but never forget that well over 50% are these young conscripts that serve just for 6 months. And when you do look at the professional force, it's probably around 150,000, which is not a lot for a country of 84 million people in a very rough part of the world. Right.
And one of the things they've done, which is causing some great consternation both with the United States and the other NATO partners, is they've gone out and purchased and received delivery of the S-400 air defense system from Russia. So that's created all sorts of complications. And if you could just kind of elaborate on that, and also what impact that's going to have You may have seen that there were comments made recently by the head of the Turkish defense industry saying that, well, we really don't want back into the F-35 program. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, the desire for Turkey to have a ballistic missile defense system and a long-range air defense system has been there, an independent capability. And it definitely, we saw the need when the Syrian civil war began, and Turkey called for NATO support, and we saw Patriots deploying and AWACS and so forth. But the desire, normally what the Turkish government wants to have, of course, is they want the kit and they want the technological transfer because they love to do things on their own.
Right.
And I don't think they were really getting what they wanted from the United States. And so they had reached out to China with the S-300 system. And I was there at the time when my Chinese colleagues thought that it was a done deal and that they were going to sell the S-300 to Turkey. But then Turkey decided not to, I think because they had pressure from Washington and Brussels. And then along comes the S-400. And there are political reasons as to why I think they bought the S-400, also national reasons as well. And so here they are with that system, and we know they test fired it. We know that Washington is unhappy, and of course that led to sanctions and being, unceremoniously tossed out of the F-35 program. And you're absolutely right with the comments that we've seen from the head of the SSB, Mr. Demir, saying, well, we don't really need the F-35 because it ties us too much to the United States. Yet we also hear that a company in the United States has been hired to advocate on the side of the Turkish government, right, perhaps to get back into the program. Of course, the Turks are saying, no, we just want a refund for the money that we've actually spent. I think probably the truth is somewhere in between. I would think that not being a part of the F-35 program is a huge blow. I know, having visited many defense factories in Turkey over several years and seeing the manufacturing parts of the F-35, how proud they were to be able to have this, this means of building very sophisticated parts of the aircraft. They have the technology, and it's a big deal. I mean, let me just say it's a big deal for them, and to be kicked out, although they're still making a few parts still, it's a blow, it's a blow. And especially when they see other countries in the region acquiring the F-35. The answer at the moment, of course, is to prolong the life of the F-16s by modernizing them.
Right.
And heavens knows up here in Canada, we know what that's all about with modernizing and upkeeping very old airplanes, as we await a decision on our next fighter jet. Now, Turkey, though, of course, as you know, Ed, they've gone that little bit further. They have their TFX program. They want to have their own fighter jet. When that gets in the air is debatable, but sometimes you hear it's going to be really soon, but one analysis said probably the first flight by 2029. This is another, it's like a decade away,
right?
And it's very expensive. And I will see, Turkey's been successful with a lot of their programs. You never know, but to go it alone, we'll probably end up with a very expensive aircraft that just doesn't meet the F-35 and what comes next. Where will we be in 10 years? Yeah. So for Turkey, it's a big deal.
Yeah, it is a big deal. One thing is, I mean, you mentioned the tensions that exist between the civilian authorities and the military who are always there and always ready to look on how they can increase their leverage, if not actually engage in overthrowing the government. And I'm wondering, how does the apparent willingness of the political leadership to just dispense with the F-35, how does that go down with the military personnel in the country? I mean, how do you think that's contributing to this tension between them?
I think, any NATO country, let's pick on NATO because Turkey is a part of NATO, wants to emulate the United States. You want to have the same type of equipment, be interoperable, have the same doctrine. Of course, you have NATO doctrine, but
Right.
you want to emulate what you consider to be one of the world's best armed forces. And so when you're not fielding the same equipment, it can lead to certain things. Of course, you might be left out of operations, or if there is a major NATO operation, you're given a secondary role somewhere off on the flank that no one cares about. You're not front and central. There are all those aspects to consider. I think for the Turkish military, if you go back to the end of the Second World War with the Marshall Plan Aid that flowed into Turkey, all the American military advisors, even Canada was giving equipment, surplus equipment to the Turkish military. From that point forward, the aim was to look like, talk like, walk like the American military. And we're not talking about young officers here. Many senior Turkish officers are in their early 60s. They've been soldiers since they went to high school when they were 14 years old. This is a mindset. You just don't, some Eurasianist that appears on the scene doesn't suddenly start changing people overnight. So when I think the Turkish military feels that they're being moved away from NATO, even slightly, it's an issue for them, because there's not really seriously anywhere for them to turn. You either can go on your own, completely on your own. There's nowhere else to turn outside of NATO. And of course, NATO is the preeminent military alliance. And so, why would you want to leave that? So I think, for the government, I think the government's aware of that too, let's say, as ugly as things can get sometimes between Brussels and Ankara and other European capitals and Ankara, there is a realization that NATO is fulfilling an important role. At the start of the day, it was to keep Stalin and the Russians out of the Bosphorus area, and I would imagine in the back of some people's minds that's still the reason why to be part of NATO. Yeah. Even though we have bought the S-400 and the Russians supply your energy, take your tomatoes, and are building a nuclear reactor for you. There has to be a balance. And one thing I've found with Turkey and its leaders, especially if you go back to like İsmet İnönü in the Second World War, one thing about Turkish leaders that they have become perfectionists at is being able to walk a fine line. They'll upset lots of people by doing it, but at the end of the day, with Turkish interests in mind, they kind of try to hold it all together. Their biggest threat really is usually from inside the country.
Right. You mentioned at the outset the number of coups that they have had in the last 70 years, and what other NATO member, Greece has had problems too, but what other NATO member has had that amount of, out in the open, essentially warfare between civilian and military control of the country?
Yeah, that's a really good point. If you do look in sort of the post-World War II period, it's not just one kind of coup. This is important. 1960 coup was a coup from below, and in the aftermath, all of the generals that weren't part of that coup were sacked, as were most of the colonels. Massive retirements. There was a palace coup amongst the leaders of the 1960 coup, and then failed coups in 62, 63, a purge of the military by the military in 1970, but a coup in 71. And the list goes on, and I'm sure your listeners know much of this. But these coups have come from below. They've come from the general staff. And even when we haven't had a coup, if you look at that period when Erdogan came into power, the party in 2002, he's there in 2003. When you look at the way the general staff treated the government, it's unimaginable in the United States or Canada, for example, that generals would not come to events because the wife of the prime minister or the president was wearing a headscarf. And then the moves to prevent Abdullah Gül becoming president in 2007. And there are many more examples of the military doing this. I would say for the moment they're in check. They're busy. and idle hands make for the devil's work, so to speak. So best to keep everybody busy. But I think the government would have to worry that what comes down the road with the armed forces, as long as Turkey is not a free-flowing, well-rounded democracy, as long as human rights are questioned, and as long as the checks and balances are not there, as long as because governments, this government leverages certain things to keep itself in power, then this government and others, if they are similar, will have to worry, I think.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think this is one of the things that people don't understand about the whole S-400 thing. It's quite clear that people within the military recognize that this has created problems. It's kind of beyond the F-35 program. I mean, in a sense, the pride of the military industrial people is wounded because they've been kicked out. And I was to the factory where they were working in the central the central fuselage. But also the other thing, there's other industries that were providing some really high-tech material, and so they're out of it, and they're disappointed by that. But my concern is that the civilian leaders don't understand the depth of resentment among some of the military people, because I think many of the military see the going for the S-400 not as just getting an air defense system that they're going to have tech transfers that the US would never give them, but it's actually pulling Turkey away from NATO and making them kind of a second or third tier member of NATO. And that, let's remember that the current defense minister had 2 billets at NATO in his career.
Yeah, I think with the S-400, Turkey points to the Greeks and others in NATO that have Russian equipment, but I always thought that they saw themselves well above the militaries that they compare themselves right now, who do have Russian equipment like the S-300, that they were superior. And to have Russian equipment, and I'm an air defense officer, I've worked with low-level systems and had the opportunity to work with Patriots on numerous exercises in the United States. I do understand the ins and outs of these systems. I realize how challenging it is to maintain them, to keep up the levels of training, the hundreds of people that are required. And it's not something you just play with. It's going to suck up your resources. The cost to fire a single missile, especially now with the way the lira is and just the general Turkish economy. If you're going to have these systems, you want to be serious. They have to be integrated, because otherwise, every time you fire a missile, I know my ADATS missiles way back in 2000 were like $350,000 each. So they're going to be massively more expensive for the S-400 system. Turkey does not have the money to waste on this sort of thing. So, it was a political gesture for sure. The Turkish military, I would say, are not happy. Of course, they have to do what they're told. They're a military. But what will happen in the end? I mean, that's the real big question. Where will these systems end up? I would imagine that most militaries, when in the Western world, when they're presented with something they don't like, will try to foot drag and wait to see who's going to be in power next, and maybe they can influence the new government. But I mean, in Turkey, after 19 years, you wonder if the Turkish military will have that option. But you can foot drag so much, or you just end up bringing them out on parades. Attending.
There's and we're running out of time, but there's an interesting shift that I've picked up here in the U.S. in the public expressions about the S-400s coming out of the new Secretary of State Tony Blinken and the National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan. It's moved from, if you don't get rid of the S-400s, you can't get back into the F-35 program, to, if you want to have good relations with the United States, forget about the F-35s, we don't care anymore. You have to get rid of the S-400s. In other words, it's creating a very difficult position for Turkey, because, in other words, unless you get rid of these things, don't box them up. Unless you get rid of them, we're not going to be able to have good relations. And personally, I find that kind of worrisome, because what options does that leave the Turks to kind of figure it out, how to rectify it?
Yeah, and I think anybody, look, anybody who knows the Turkish mindset, and I would think it would be for any country, even any country, not just Turkey, to be told by the United States to get rid of something is, especially when there's a realization you've probably made a mistake in acquiring them in the first place.
Right.
But then to be told, get rid of them or else, yeah, you're gonna put Turkey's back against the wall, and it's not gonna go well until some other solution is found. I mean, look, at the end of the day, the only people that are happy about the S-400 deal are the Russians.
Right.
And not because they got to sell a bit of equipment, which I think they had to give the Turks, a loan to buy in the first place. I mean, they succeeded in creating the rift that we're seeing in NATO, Turkey, between Brussels, Ankara, and Washington. And I think for them, that would be, a win, and it'd be a check mark, and happy about that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that the money involved, I don't think that's what the Russians cared about. I think you're absolutely right. What they really cared about was that they were creating another bit of tension between Brussels, Ankara, and the U.S. And Washington. I think you're absolutely right about that. And what you also say about the Turks may have some regrets, some buyer's remorse at this point. Let's see if that second system shows up, and that I guess they call them a regiment. That second regiment shows up and is deployed and is used. But the point you made earlier about the fact that if this is not integrated into their entire air defense system, and it's not connected to what is now kind of a NATO overlay that they're plugged into, what utility does it have?
Yeah, it has a local, it can be used locally, but even then it creates issues, because what kind of IFF codes are being used, and what other sharing is being done. You've got drones, you've got airplanes, you've got satellites, and in the NATO system, they're all talking to one another, because we've kind of worked all of that out. And now if you're having to rejig a few things, this is an extra burden that you don't need. And so, yeah, they'll take the second regiment. Maybe. I would say that if they do, it's more focused on the domestic side of the house. Everything is being done right now to clear the way for the elections of 2023 is when we expect them to be. Everything's being done for that, whether it's this attempt, which at the moment's been put on ice, to close down the HDP, whether it's withdrawing from the Istanbul Convention for Women's Rights, to bolster the base. So accepting the S-400s, again, not good if you were to box them up and send them back for your base. And so, we may be looking at what we might call the pre-2023 period, where these arguments will go back and forth, and the post-2023 period. And who knows, that's in an entirely other podcast that we can do.
Well, I mean, we didn't touch that. I mean, we haven't really touched much on this, because 2023 is, we think, oh, well, it's so far away. It's 2 years. It's 2 years. And
it'll be upon us very quickly.
Yeah, electoral politics, it seems to drag on, but at the same time, it's all happening real fast. I mean, I'm quite sure that President Erdogan is strategizing about the 2023 elections right now. I mean, he's not going to wait for another year. I mean, he's on it.
No, you're right. And the S-400s are part of it. And to lose face, to have spent all of that money, which, we know the Treasury really doesn't have.
Right.
This would be really politically problematic. So
Yeah.
it could be that we don't see any movement until 2 years from now.
Yeah, and I think, if right now you want to take out your crystal ball and say, what is going to be the biggest issue in 2023? The first answer is going to be the economy. But that's based on right now with the lira at 8 point whatever to the dollar, and nothing on the horizon that is going to fix that. Also, the second thing would be the handling of the pandemic, which hasn't been going really well in Turkey. Those are, tougher issues. But again, for another day, because we're running up against our clock. It's kind of a shame that we're limited to 30 minutes, but at the same time, if we made these into more than 30 minutes, we'd probably lose some audience people. So we give them a taste of what we're going to do the next time.
Okay, sounds good. That was great, Ed.
And one of the things I want you to have in the back of your mind is that we are coming up, and it will also be upon us faster than we can imagine, and that is the 5th year anniversary of the coup attempt. And
yes.
So, kind of pencil us in so we can maybe then we will do, maybe we can get somebody else and we can have a little conversation and debate about, what has 5 years of post-coup living brought to Turkey and its relations with the US, with Canada, with the rest of NATO, and so forth and so on. And also maybe I'll have some more understanding of what Secretary of State Blinken and Jake Sullivan are up to.
Sounds good.
But anyway, this was great, and I think it's very useful. I think it was very useful to remind people that this whole kind of ongoing process with regards to the politicization of the military and how they do have factions and how they do, the government, the civilians do things that actually almost create fertile ground and nice watering of these different flowerings of faction.
Yeah, and to think otherwise is just to be naive. If folks think it's 2021 and this is a day, these days are over, then they are being naive. No one expected in 2016 that a faction of the military, regardless of who they were, they call them Gulenists or Kemalists, put whatever label you like.
Yeah.
A group in the armed forces attempted and failed to overthrow the government, and it wasn't 1960, and there wasn't just one radio station to capture, and events got away on them. There's a lot to talk about there, but don't think for 1 minute that the military's days are over because they had a couple of trials a few years ago and a coup and some current issues. Yeah. No, the conditions create the conditions.
Yep. All right. Well, thank you very much. We'll be in touch, and I hope we can do this again in a couple weeks or 3 weeks or something like that. And I'm going to sign off because that's part of the process. But then if you have a minute, we can come back and talk for a bit.
Sure.
Okay.